Stop. Before we talk about the war, let's rewind to the very beginning, to the very start of this crisis. The first thing we need to do is to figure out how all of this started. 2 years ago, people in Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, came out to mass protest against the decision by then-President Viktor Yanukovych to postpone the signing of an economic treaty between Ukraine and the European Union. Yanukovych argued that completely opening up the Ukrainian economy to European goods would hurt local producers, because they wouldn't be able to compete with cheaper and heavily subsidized European goods. This, in turn, would cause producers to go out of business, countless layoffs, and significantly hurt the economy. He didn't abandon the treaty completely, but just postponed its signing in order to better prepare the Ukrainian economy for new realities. His political and business opponents used the postponement of the treaty in order to mobilize the Ukrainian people into a movement called the Euromaidan. While the majority of protesters were initially peaceful, anti-Yanukovych oligarchs, who actually made their vast fortunes in corrupt schemes stealing from the people of Ukraine, now sponsored the movement for their own financial gain, also paid radical nationalists to battle the police, drawing peaceful protesters into the crossfire. Blood was spilled on both sides, many people tragically died, and the police and the government, in order to save lives, backed down. Thus, Yanukovych, the legitimate, constitutional and democratically elected president, was overthrown in a nationalist coup, sponsored by the very same oligarchs who stole billions of dollars from the people of Ukraine. Western governments obviously wanted the Ukraine market to open up to their goods and to bring Ukraine into their orbit. And they didn't really care what pain it would cause to the Ukrainian economy and actively supported anti-government protests, both morally by coming to Kiev and financially. The US State Department admitted to having spent $5 billion of US taxpayers' money to help foster anti-government protests. And US Undersecretary of State Victoria Nuland, in her famous "Fuck the EU" intercept, discusses with the US ambassador in Ukraine which protest leader would hold what post in the future government. Now, just imagine this happening in the United States or Europe. Russia or China sponsoring anti-EU rallies in Greece or Spain, or anti-government rallies in the US for that matter, or Russian Foreign Ministry actively donating money to one political party, coming to their rallies, and then telling them who would run what ministry. So after the nationalist coup in Kiev, the first act of the so-called revolutionary parliament was to repeal a law giving language rights to Russian speakers. Since the vast majority of southeast Ukraine is Russian-speaking, they came out to protest this, and to demand that the revolutionary central government respect their basic rights. They also wanted for Ukraine to become a federation. Many of the most prominent countries in the world are federations, where people have both local as well as federal elections. Brazil, India, Canada, Germany, and many others have federal forms of government. The United States, at the time of its creation, also had Federalist and Anti-Federalist parties. George Washington, as well as most founding fathers, were Federalists. But in Ukraine, the president in Kiev appoints governors to all the regions of Ukraine, and the people of the region don't have a say about it. Just imagine if somebody in Washington, D.C. appointed the governor of Arizona or Massachusetts. How happy would the people there be? Especially if the government in Washington was actively hostile and disrespectful to the people of that state. Obama appointing a hardcore left-wing liberal as governor of Texas, or George Bush before him appointing a hardcore conservative to run California. Would the people not come out to protest this violation of their rights? Of course they would. However, despite hundreds of thousands of people in south and east Ukraine coming out to peaceful rallies calling for Ukraine to become a federation and to have guaranteed minority rights, the government in Kiev completely ignored their calls, branded them separatists and later terrorists, and refused to talk to them. And when some of the protesters occupied and peacefully held few government buildings, just like the protesters did during the Euromaidan in Kiev before, letting people come to work and go from work every day without really disrupting the work process, the central government, instead of trying to negotiate with the Federalists, declared the entire Donbass region a terrorist zone, started bombarding cities with heavy artillery and air force, destroying the local infrastructure, killing countless civilian, elderly, women, and children. Obviously, when the death toll started to rise, and when the Ukrainian forces in cities that they held started acting like marauding occupational force, stealing from locals, abusing the citizens, kidnapping, and even executing people who didn't disagree with the regime, or just kidnapping people for ransom, more and more people started to organize themselves in order to fight back. And the people of eastern industrial region of Donbass declared Donetsk Republic and Lugansk Republic, where the rights and freedoms of people would be respected. So after the republics were declared by local activists, both republics held democratic referendums with Western observers present, where locals overwhelmingly supported the creation of the new political entities. But they still didn't go as far as declaring independence, and still appealed to Kiev to negotiate the federalization of the country, where regions and people in various regions would have guaranteed rights. But instead of negotiating, Kiev responded by sending in the army and nationalist battalions, who started indiscriminately bombing civilian areas. Obviously, local people had no choice but to take up arms to defend their land. And those are the people fighting on the front lines today. Locals, people who used to be miners or office clerks, fighting for their freedom from government oppression, fighting for their lands, their homes, and their families. So, we came here to the front lines, to the town of Gorlovka or Horlivka, to find out who the soldiers here are, what they're fighting for, and whether the local people support them or not.
Живу с самого детства, с самого рождения. Мои родители здесь родились. Мой ребенок здесь родился. Мы здесь стоим на своей земле. Нам неохота никакой войны, нам хочется свободы.
Никогда к Украине плохо не относились. Болели все сюда за одну национальную команду, там, по футболу и остальным. Хотели разговаривать на своем языке, на языке предков, которые разговаривали постоянно. Которые воевали против немцев вместе с союзниками США, Англии, Франции.
I'm from Horlov. Russia, they help, but mostly is moral support. There are Russia volunteers too, but we have volunteers from all over the world. From the England, Spain, Brazil and others. Great guys, we are thankful for them. We are fighting for our lands and homes. They can stay home, but they choose come and help us. Because we are fighting for truth. We are fighting to save our homes. Ukraine fighting to destroy them. That's why volunteers come and fighting for the truth.
Да, местный город Горловка, улица 6, я живу на 5-м квартале. У моей мамы были свои 3 точки на центральном рынке, частный предприниматель. Вот. Училась вот в 65-й школе и ходила в 15-й садик. Нету здесь российской армии, здесь все местные жители. Кто с Донецка, кто с Горловки, кто с Макеевки, кто с Янакиева, все свои. Нет, я не хочу воевать, я хочу, чтобы закончилась война, потому что у меня у самой 2 детей маленьких, они всю бомбежку просидели здесь, в Горловке, никуда не выезжая. У меня тоже маленький, 4 года ребенку, он раненый, как бы, да, куча осколков в нем. Как бы не мы в Киев пришли, они к нам пришли. Вот, поэтому мы взяли оружие, понимаешь? Поэтому не каждому приятно, когда разлетаются куски тела твоего близкого, брата, сестры.
Мы поддерживаем ополчение, потому что то, что творится на той стороне, это ни в какие рамки не входит. Там творится беспредел, там насилуют людей, это мы знаем не с радио, а именно наши люди это говорят с той стороны.
Жив мы не видели никого, чтобы кто-то там были какие-то войска или что у нас тут. Нету, все свои. Все знают, что нужно защищать. У каждого дети, у каждого там жены, все. Поэтому они идут.
So, the people of Donbass are fighting for their rights and their freedoms. But what about the rest of Ukraine? What do they think about this war and about the people here in Donbass? May Day Barbecue. That was a popular joke about over 50 unarmed people burned alive in Odessa on the 2nd of May of 2014. Women, these are female insects. Didn't you study biology in school? F them. There are no people in Lugansk. Only carpet bombing can save them. 450,000 amoebas deserving to be wiped out. When we kill them, just keep in mind, these are not humans. Not enough. Not enough. We should kill more of those animals. Let's kill 700. I need to thank you Russians for one thing. I understand now. I am a fascist. And all of you need to be wiped out like a cancer. The only question is what to do with your wives and children. Just cut them to pieces or burn them first. Those beasts will never be Ukrainians and will always be a sore on our country's body. We need to keep bombing Donetsk and Lugansk until all of those animals die. This territory should be cleared of all people. Starting from scratch will be easier than making people out of those beasts. And the 10% of real Ukrainians who live there, we should bring to us. Keep up the anti-terrorist war. Unfortunately, there are thousands of comments just like these, which speaks to the toxic level of hatred in Ukraine towards Donetsk and Lugansk republics, and the people who live here. With such murderous rage and hatred directed at them, it is no wonder that the people of Donbass have picked up arms and are fighting tooth and nail for every inch of their land. But despite all the hardships, life in Donbass goes on. Couples fall in love and get married. New children, the future the people here are fighting for, are being born. All this, people here building their future, goes on despite the fact that after failing to subdue Donbass militarily, Kiev started an economic blockade against the republics. A year ago, President Poroshenko signed a law that imposes a total blockade against Donbass. But just like ancient Mossad or World War II Leningrad didn't bow down when besieged by Romans or Hitler, neither will the people of Donbass.
We hope this video helped you better understand what is really going on in southern and east Ukraine, why this conflict started, and what the people of Donbass are fighting for. These are not some terrorists or the Russian army. They're just hardworking, honest people who only picked up arms as a last resort when time and again the government in Kiev failed to listen to their peaceful and legitimate demands. And instead of trying to find a compromise, find a solution, sit down and negotiate, unleash the full force of the Ukrainian army on anyone who dares disagree with Kiev.